Hello, I'm Michael Hurst and I'm taking over Masuda for this lecture. Basically in this lecture what we're going to be discussing is the concept of future interfaces. And before we can begin this lecture, it's important that whereas all the other lectures in this module you've been discussing very core understanding of principles that you'd find in human-computer interaction, what we're going to be doing in this lecture is we're going to be taking this one step further and kind of trying to predict the future, what you might find as time progresses and as technology advances. And what I want you to do in this lecture is I want you to basically obviously watch the lecture first, but then do a bit of background research, look at what other ideas have come about in the past and how interfaces basically ended up and iterated to what we find them today. And I want you to bring questions to the guru session that you'll have later on, and basically bring forth your opinions, because this is going to be a very discussion-orientated lecture, very discussion-orientated topic, because there's no right or wrong answer. And I'll kind of go into that as time progresses. So to begin, the objective of this session is to kind of explore how we think interfaces are going to progress over the next 10, 20, even 30 years. And we're going to discuss how technological advancements will have an effect on this. And also we're going to discuss the kind of motivations that will influence the future user interfaces as we progress. This is the outline of the presentation. And as I said, it's very important to do some of your own resources, your own background reading. And these are just some of the things. There's plenty out there. And you're probably seeing quite a lot of the stuff already. But feel free to have a look at these and feel free to have an explore yourself. Especially because as the field progresses, it's important that you keep on oncoming trends in whatever computer-related field you're doing. If you fail to be on top of the wave, for example, then there's a good chance that you'll fall behind it very, very quickly, and it's always good to keep on top of it. So it's good practice as you start your careers after university. Basically, there's one industry that is more often than not predicted the trend for user interfaces as time goes on, and that's science fiction. On the slide, there's 5 examples there where people hundreds of years ago have theorized certain things happening in the future, and even centuries have passed and that has actually been achieved. And you might find that's a bit strange. Focus on interfaces specifically. You might have seen science fiction movies, or you might have read science fiction books that were written or made quite a while ago, and in recent times you might have seen that actually happening. One example is about 10 or 15 years ago there's a film called Minority Report, very famous, and you'll see a picture on one of the oncoming slides. And in that particular film, I think it was Tom Cruise, but I might be mistaken, he controls a computer just purely by gestures and holograms, I believe it was. And now you actually can see interfaces starting to occur which can be completely controlled by gestures. Another example is Star Trek. Star Trek theorized tricorders, and I think it was the 1970s and 1980s. And now what do? We talk to people on mobile phones, which used to be flip, but now are touchscreen mobile phones. Very similar to the principles that tricorders were in the past. And these have gone, touchscreen computers have boomed in the last 5 or 10 years, especially now that tablet computers are very, very common in society. And modern user interfaces have become realistic because the technologies now exist. You might ask yourself, so why is science fiction more often than not predicted correctly? And there's a good reason for that, and the reason lies in stereotypes. And I know you've often said that stereotypes should be ignored and stereotypes shouldn't be confined to, but if I was to give you an example, in this lecture we've got about 40 students, and of that 40 students, there's probably a higher proportion of people that like science fiction in this lecture than, say, an English literature lecture or an English language lecture, for example, because of stereotypes. You tend to find the people that do computer science will be more interested in science fiction than those that don't. And if you want to do a significance testing on that, you're quite welcome to do so if you've got enough time away from your coursework. But then, there's also a correlation between the degree that you do and what kind of industry you'd be working in the future. There's a good chance that the people in this room, some of you, will be working in interface design in the future, because everyone's got an interest in interface design in this lecture. So it's not so much the fact that science fiction has predicted these things. Science fiction has influenced the people that now work in interface design. So someone that invented tablet computing, so for example Steve Jobs might have seen Star Trek 20 years ago and thought, oh, that's a good idea, I might try and make that when technology improves. So that's basically the reason why you're finding science fiction to be a major predictor of trends going forward. So within the rest of the lecture we're going to be discussing what we'd expect future interaction methods to be. And as I said, there's no right or wrong answer to this. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through kind of different iterations of what you'd expect to see. And the first one I'm going to discuss is something that's now very, very common in society, and that's touch and gesture interfaces. And the thing that touch and gesture interfaces do that improve on the traditional mouse interaction is to allow you to do things in 3 dimensions. So whereas a mouse you can either go left or right, forward and back, touch and gestures allow you to use your whole body and express in a way that you would do when you'd normally be interacting with other people. So touch is becoming very common through the use of touch screens, because it allows you to directly control something. If you were to, for example, press a button on the vending machine, you wouldn't do that by using a mouse, you'd want to actually physically touch it. And the same goes for gesture. If you were gesture is basically the next iteration of touch, because if you were to try and get someone's attention, it'd be very, very unwise to go up to someone and just start poking them. You'd be wanting to do something which is more natural, like waving to them or using gestures to get their attention. Gestures, for example, there's a lot of work on Microsoft Connect, and there's a lot of research projects about which is used in gesture interfaces for all different kinds of things. Especially gaming, medical, and all different kind of things. So have a look at some of your own. And the thing that gestures allow is that seamless integration between what you would do in the real world and a computer-generated environment. And if you look on the bottom, there is a picture of Minority Report where Tom Cruise, I think it's Tom Cruise, I'm still not sure, interacts with people, interacts with a computer just by using gesture interface. But even though that film was based 15 years ago, it's now become more and more apparent. So once gesture interfaces have been launched, in which there are already plenty around and become advanced, you might think, okay, that's great. There obviously can't be anything better than using gestures to control the environment that you're in. But you're wrong, because computers, interface designers are always trying to get the next best interaction. And one of the ways of doing that is the introduction of Google Glass. So going back to the example of trying to get another person's attention, you could use your gestures, you could wave at them, you could do all these kind of things. But imagine talking to someone and you wouldn't constantly be waving at them to keep their attention, you'd be looking at them. And that's the principle you'd find in Google Glass. And Google Glass, for those that don't know, is basically a head-mounted camera display which allows you to project a computer interface on top of the reality that you're interacting with day by day. And there's a lot of research at the moment which is using Google Glass to try and improve that interaction. So by looking at something you can control something. And one of the big fields where Google Glass integration is in driver safety, because it can be very distracting. You're not supposed to be distracted away from what your core purpose is to drive the car, but you still want to interact with other devices around you. So this is what Google Glass is all about. So you've gone from going up to touching something, you've gone from waving to something, you've gone to looking at something, and surely you think now that's going to be it. But there isn't, because there is another step which you can do. And the next step, away from looking at something, is thinking about something. And this is where the field of brain-computer interaction comes in. Brain-computer interaction tends to be abbreviated to BCI, and it can be used in a whole variety of ways. And it goes back to science fiction. There was a famous movie in the 1990s, I believe it is, or early 2000s, called The Matrix. I'm sure plenty of people do it. And it was basically using your thought processes to directly interact. And that allows you to do a whole host of things that previously was not available to you. And you might think BCI is a bit of a flash in the pan. You don't think it's going to happen for 20 years, but it's already happening, and there's plenty of examples already out there. And as I go on to that, there was one example that in science fiction not long ago in a TV drama called House, where there was a medical patient who couldn't interact at all, and they thought he was brain dead. But by using brain-computer action, they could start interacting with it. And that is actually more feasible than it sounds. And there is examples of people, such as those you'd find in, say, Stephen Hawking's case, where they interact with computers and with other people, use computers to interact with other people through their thought patterns. So it's not impractical, and there are current systems out there, but it's in its very, very early stages. There is practical and commercial exists. And if you look at the slide and the image on the top right-hand corner of the slide, you can see what a typical device would look like. These systems were very medical-based in research, say 10 or 20 years ago. And you've probably seen them in some films with hundreds of little dots placed on your scalp in a big thing. But that's not the case anymore, because as devices become more commercial, you can now pick them up for less than $200. These examples called the Epoch Emotive or the Nero MindSky. Have a look at those if you have enough time. And they allow for a headset to be worn which can be directly controlled for certain things on the screen. And I would like to draw your attention to a certain YouTube video where people started implementing these devices into gaming, and there's one particular one that always rings to mind. If you Google brainwave interaction Angry Birds, you can see someone completing a level of Angry Birds just by thinking about what they're trying to do. So even though these systems are in their infancy, they are already around, and you would expect to see them as time carries on. And there is a concept of affective computing. And basically what affective computing is the introduction of a HCI and a user experience element to brain-computer interfaces. And affective computing is basically, the easy way to put it is to introduce emotional states to interaction. So when you're interacting with another person, one of your friends, if you think about it, your interaction is very emotionally charged. So you might say the same things, you might do the same things, but there's more. If the other person is picking up that you're angry or sad or happy, their predicted response will be dramatically different. So these kind of things, emotional state is a big variable in the lives, and that was just one occasion where a different outcome has been resulted because of an emotional response. But you can probably think of plenty of other examples of that. And in order to get a true user experience, emotional state must be integrated, because emotional is too much of a variable in our lives in order to not integrate it. Your emotional state has so much of an effect on how you do things, what you say, how you achieve tasks, that it has to be integrated. And brain-computer interfaces allow you to do this. And it allows you to do this by doing a couple of things, but mainly looking at how observing electrical activities in certain areas of the brain. And there's a lot of neuro science out there which is exploring the link between different areas of the brain and different emotions. And it's very interesting to have a look at that if you've got any spare time. So, affective computing is not just brains. It's not just EEG as what brain-computer interfaces do. It's also using a whole different range of methods, because none of these methods are foolproof. So it's using traditional methods that psychologists would use in the past, such as facial expressions, your gestures, your voice, your context of your voice, your content of your voice, generally body language. And more modern methods, because as wearable computers have increased, computers can now understand your heart rate, your perspiration, your blood oxygenation levels. And the device which I showed you on the previous one was an EEG device, and I won't pronounce that word because I can never pronounce it on the slide. But it allows you to measure two key things. One is your engagement, and it can be measured by kind of your general electrical activity in your brain. And one can be your happiness, and that's it can be measured by looking at electrical activity in certain locations. So in the class, we're going to do two things. I'm going to bring in one of these devices for you to have a look at. Feel free to have a look beforehand online, see some of the videos that people have put. But I'll bring one of these in. We'll do a bit of demonstration and see what kind of things we can come up with. And I want you to also think about what kind of areas you think these devices could be implemented into. And as I said, there's no right or wrong answer. It'd just be interesting to hear your thoughts. And we're also going to be doing a practical task, so feel free to have a look at the practical task before you come to lecture and start getting some ideas to it and bring those ideas with you. So what we're going to do now is feel free to go back and watch some science fiction movies that you might have seen past interfaces in and bring those ideas with you. Thank you.